Adobe Premiere is one of the most popular video editing software programs on the planet. Many people use this, and many use it for small films, music videos, YouTube videos, and much more. Adobe Premiere has had a long history since the early 1990s. Contrary to what you may have heard, Adobe isn't exactly the industry standard in film and television. That title goes to Avid Media Composer, which I am looking forward to making a video in the future. But Adobe is still very important. Adobe and its suite of tools are widely used in the creative industry and are very important. Photoshop is even used as a verb in some cases, since it's so iconic and widespread. Before we get started here, let's give a shout out to our wonderful members who support the channel. Before we talk about Adobe, let's talk about what video editing was like before non-linear editing software became a thing. In the very early days, editing consisted of physically cutting and splicing together film strips with scissors, tape, and glue. This was really all you really could do in those early days. Editors were not thinking extremely creatively in this way, but in more of a very literal, so if I take off 24 frames here, how will this differ from 48 frames, for example? Later on, machines like Flatbeds were used in order to edit film. These machines were great improvements for the editor. Now the editor could see the film in real time, as well as hear the film too. They can mark in and outs on their film, and this process felt much like how digital editing is today. You could see the film in real time and edit it in real time. This was a great improvement. The director can now watch the film with the editor to see how it was turning out. Flatbeds boosted the potential and creativity for filmmakers. Some very iconic films were edited somewhat using flatbeds, like Star Wars, Apocalypse Now, Raging Bull, E.T., and many other popular movies from this era. The feel of the flatbed is actually stuck around on the user's end. The horizontal timeline is just like the horizontal strips of film. While editing, the playhead is much like the control knob, and the different tracks and layers are much like the different layers of film. Flatheads started to decline after the innovations in digital editing. Computers were now powerful enough for studios to use them to edit film. But it wasn't just a computer, it was great software that sprang up letting this happen. Avid Media Composer was released in 1989 on the Macintosh II.
Okay, I've built the program. Now I want to make a change. I want to put an effect in between this shot and that shot. Well, in normal video editing, you can only overwrite the material. In this nonlinear editor, you can splice in, just like in film. In fact, let's take the effect, bring it to our source window here. I'm going to come over here and find the point where I want it. I want it to be right between these two elements. So I go to that point right after he hits the ball. Right before that, set my in and do a splice in. Now I've made the program longer. Let's take a look at the result.
How this software worked was you digitize the film with high compression, then you would make the edits digitally. Now after this is finished, the software would give you a list of all the cuts and edits made on the film. So now after this, you take that list and apply the edits to the real film, and then you're essentially finished. This process was much faster and more reliable than physically cutting the film, not to mention cheaper. Economically, this was the way the industry was going to go. Enter Randy Ubilous. Randall Hayes Ubilous is, well, I can't find his age or any education. In fact, I can't find out a lot about the guy besides information on his contributions to non-linear editing. As someone who essentially started non-linear editing for regular people, I'd expect some more information about him. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, and his Apple Wikipedia page is also very scarce. But what we do know about him is that in the early 1990s, he was working for a company called SuperMac Technologies, working on video capture device hardware for Macs. Around the same time, QuickTime was in beta. Ubilous created a demo of a non-linear editing software called ReelTime, which was a short demo for what could be possible video editing-wise on the Mac. SuperMac was like Dude, what do we do with this? And then they sold it to Adobe in 1991. Adobe released this, and this is what was known as Adobe Premiere 1.0. In my digging after the first version of the script was finished, I was able to find Randy's Instagram, but he no longer posts here, instead giving a Blue Sky link. He does have a website, however, where he posts his travels. Links to both will be in the description. Ubilous joined Adobe for Premiere 1.0 to 4.0, then he later left Macromedia to work on Key Grip, later becoming Final Cut Pro, where he spent the rest of his time at Apple. But continuing on Premiere and Ubilous, the first few years of the project were led by him. As for the features of 1.0, it was very primitive by today's standards. It could handle 160 by 120 video at 15 frames a second. It supported drag and drop editing, ran on Macintosh computers using QuickTime, and could export back to tape or digital video. So Premiere was a very primitive software, but this had incredible potential, and as you know today, they used that potential very well. Premiere 2.0 added Windows support, so now this was a software which was cross-platform. They added basic compositing and effects, as well as a more stable timeline. They also added support for external capture cards to get the full NTSC/PAL resolution into the software. Premiere 3.0 is considered the last version that Ubilous really worked on. 3.0 is also when Adobe Premiere became more than just a tool for amateurs. It started to get picked up by the industry just a bit more. 3.0 added some great stuff like better playback performance, editing broadcast quality media, more advanced title designers, much better timeline editing, and much more support for cross-platform use. 3.0 also added plugin support, which is a pretty big deal with the more professional editing workflows. Now, this is where the story gets a bit murky. Adobe isn't exactly extremely public with the goings-on within the internal projects at the company. But from what I've gathered, Ubilous left the company after 3.0 and during the development of 4.0, as we said, joining Macromedia to start working on what would become Final Cut Pro. If you want to see what he did there, then check out the Final Cut Pro video I did a few months ago. What can be said, however, is that 4.0 was the last version to have Ubilous credited. 4.0 added features that are taken granted today, like a very clear UI control system, multiple projects open at once, and nested sequences, better audio control for audio tracks, and an increased number of tracks in general, as well as better support for QuickTime Media and AVI Media natively. There's also better integration with capture cards, giving the users the ability to edit very good looking footage at that time. An even better update to the title designers are made, and better integration within Photoshop, starting the foundations of the Creative Suite. Premiere was aimed towards prosumer and light professional editing at this time. As for some context, this was released in 1995, when Avid's Media Composer and Lightworks completely dominated the high-end broadcasting editing sector. 4.0 was aiming right below that level. 4.0 also brought video editing into classrooms and in general made it more accessible to the public. 5.0 was released in 1998 and things started to change. This was the first major UI change since Ubilous's original layout for the application. The timeline, bins, and monitors were made more modular and dockable, something that we still have today. There was a new project window for better organization of files. However, much like when UI changes, a lot of the users did not like this, and it felt a lot more cluttered and complex. Digital video was also natively supported for the first time here with Firewire. 3 and 4-point editing was also added, something already inside Avid's product. Rolling, ripple, and slip trims were also added, something commonly used today in professional editing. Keyframing was also added, so now you could animate stuff. There was also a much better color correction system in place. Photoshop integration became better, and transparent layers now stay intact when importing PSDs into the project. After Effects integration was also significantly made better. This was building more of the foundations of the modern Dynamic Link Creative Suite system we have today in Adobe. The title system was also expanded upon, and audio editing was also expanded upon. All these great features did not come without some issues, however. Sort of like the Final Cut Pro rewrite in the early 2010s, this version was pretty buggy, and many decided to stick with Premiere 4.2 since it lacked many of the bugs. Once 5.1 was released, however, a lot of these bugs were patched, so that really wasn't an issue anymore. 5.0 marked a big turning point for the modern non-linear editing software. Now that digital video was supported and it came with more professional tools for editing video, this became a good contender for indie and consumer-grade media creation. By 1999, Final Cut Pro 1.0 was released and it put Adobe to shame. Adobe struck back, however, with Premiere 6.0 in 2000. 6.0 was rebuilt for stability, especially after the shaky launch of 5.0. Adobe reworked the rendering engine for better playback, and it also ran much smoother on both Windows and Mac. So now longer and higher resolution projects can be edited without constant crashing. Performance was also greatly improved when using DV capture cards and FireWire devices. The timeline became more complex and flexible, allowing for better snapping behavior and clearer trimming. Multiple sequences could be opened within a single project now, something the professionals loved and what soon became standard. Real-time previews were also added, so you could see transitions and effects instantly. The titler was redesigned once again, allowing for better text animation, and fonts could also be imported from Photoshop with the proper transparency. Integration within other Adobe apps was also made a lot better, like audio editing with what would become Audition Cool Edit Pro. Better motion controls were added, CPU and GPU accelerated transitions were also added, brightness, chroma key, balance, and contrast filters were all added too. Export presets for popular web formats were also included. Integration with DVD authoring software was added as well. Also exporting an MPEG-2 for DVD creation. Keep in mind, this was the age when independent content and media were just starting to boom. This was about a half decade away from YouTube, but this is what I personally call the age of the home movie or home video. Video editing and exporting the content onto physical media was now cheap enough and easy enough for the average person to do so. The iMac DV, something we touched upon in the iMovie video, was released in 1999, so most Mac users could fully use these tools to make their own content for their families or to even enter into film festivals. Mac users, however, were switching over to Final Cut Pro and iMovie at this time, so Adobe started to take hold really well in the Windows-oriented market. For some historical context, Final Cut Pro, as we just said, was in fact taking over the Mac market. Avid still remained supreme in the professional world, and Premiere 6.0 just kind of kept Adobe going. But what was coming next was going to shock the market. Premiere Pro 1.0 was released in 2003. You may not even have noticed that all the mentions of Premiere so far in this video did not have Pro following it. Well, that's because Premiere Pro is a whole different piece of software, much like Final Cut Pro and Final Cut Pro 10. Premiere Pro is the new way forward for video editing. Adding the Pro to the title signified its new branding as being professional software, and personally I think it worked. Before I found out about Avid, I just assumed Premiere Pro was the standard within the industry. Premiere Pro was completely rewritten for the new era. Tools carried over from Premiere 6.0 are updated to feel more like those found in Avid's tools, in Avid's product I should say. Although Ubilous left the project several years prior, his influence was still felt in the fact that he was now leading the biggest real competitor to Premiere Pro. Despite these new updates, it still wasn't considered professional grade. Many pros still opted to use Avid or Final Cut. Also, Premiere Pro 1.0 was a Windows-only product, and in an industry where they mostly used Macs, this really wasn't the best way to get an edge over Final Cut Pro. Premiere 1.5 was released in 2004. 1.5 addressed performance issues and refined it much more, making it better for users to actually create stuff. It was released as part of Adobe's Video Collection 2.5, with After Effects 6.5, Audition 1.5, and Encore DVD 1.5. Looks like we were at the halfway mark for these. Premiere Pro 2.0 was released in 2006 alongside the Adobe Production Studio, with After Effects, Photoshop, Audition, and Encore. Adobe fully introduced the dynamic link ecosystem, so you could use files from across all the different types of software. They would all mesh together really well. Better color correction and timeline improvements were also made, as well as improvements in the audio production side. Dynamic link was a great feature since it allowed projects to be sent to After Effects without needing to be rendered. Customizable workspaces were also added, making it tailor-made for specific workflows. Speaking of these, let me show you mine. I use a custom one. Everything I need is right where I usually keep it or need it. I have my audio mixers right here, effects controls right here. Everything I usually consult when editing video for the channel, I just have it up there. Having a large display does help. I don't think I could ever do this on like a 1080p monitor, or a significantly smaller monitor, I should say. However, this was still a Windows-only app at this time, but that would soon change. Premiere Pro 2.0 was finally a version that could actually rival Final Cut Pro. In 2007, once Apple finished the Intel transition, check that video out if you haven't already. Funny how all these videos kind of mesh together and they have that little link together. It's almost like they're in the same realm of computing. Adobe Premiere Pro could finally be brought to Mac OS X. But now that Adobe was back on Mac with Premiere Pro CS3, Adobe could give Final Cut Pro a real challenge. This build of Premiere was much more stable and came with many more performance updates. Adobe Media Encoder was also released, being a standalone app for rendering files in the background. Creative Suite 3 came with better multicam editing, better titlers and keyframing tools, and a much better effects control panel. 2007 also marked the year the individual was given more power on the internet to upload their own work, with the use of many websites like YouTube. Adobe wasn't the only editor of choice for the users of YouTube at this time. Many others, like the aforementioned Final Cut Pro and iMovie, were solid choices for people in the Mac world. The angry video game nerd used Final Cut Pro for his early years in the website. For example, Sony Vegas, something which was a Windows-only application. YouTubers like EmpLemon and myself for about a period of about 5 years used this. It was a very viable option. Sony Vegas was great. Premiere was like the step-up tool for the editors and content creators on the website. Once software like iMovie or Sony Vegas just really wasn't enough for them anymore, they could move on to more powerful software to make their vision come true. YouTube created a demand for good software, and tools like Premiere Pro and Final Cut Pro were the supply. Premiere had a great advantage over Final Cut Pro, however, since Premiere was now on both of the biggest operating systems, meaning there is a much larger pool of potential users. YouTube also made a great website to host tutorials on how to use the software, meaning more people could learn very easily. While YouTube was turning everyday people into editors, Adobe was about to make a major business move that would reshape the entire software industry, not just video editing. In 2013, Adobe announced that it was moving away from physical software boxes and perpetual licenses in favor of a new system called the Adobe Creative Cloud. Instead of buying Premiere Pro, Photoshop, or After Effects outright, you would now pay a monthly or annual subscription to use them. This was a very controversial decision at the time, and in many ways it still is very controversial. A lot of users were not happy about renting their tools instead of outright owning them. But for Adobe, this made perfect sense. Creative Cloud lets Adobe deliver updates faster, push out performance fixes more often, and most importantly, it kept all its apps deeply integrated for the cloud. For Premiere users, that meant seamless connections with After Effects for motion graphics, Audition for audio cleanup, and Photoshop for stills, without ever leaving the ecosystem. The old Creative Suite era, where users had to manually update each app and manually buy them, was now over. For creators, this model had a huge side effect: accessibility. The barrier to entry was much lower now. You didn't need to shell out hundreds of dollars for a boxed version of Premiere. You could just pay a small monthly fee and instantly have access to the same tools the pros used. For YouTubers and independent filmmakers, that was pretty game-changing. At the same time, Adobe was investing heavily in GPU acceleration and cross-platform optimization, which made Premiere perform far better on consumer hardware. By the mid-2010s, even mid-range laptops could handle HD very well and 4K video pretty well if it's a decent, if it's a decent laptop. Combine that with the Creative Cloud libraries, templates, and stock assets, as well as automatic project syncing, and suddenly Premiere wasn't just a piece of software, it was an entire creative ecosystem. Another subtle but important move Adobe made during this period was embracing online education and social media. With the explosion of tutorial content on YouTube, ironically often made using Premiere, more people than ever were learning professional editing workflows from home. This created a self-sustaining cycle. People used Premiere to make videos, uploaded them to YouTube, and inspired others to download Premiere and do the exact same thing. While some professionals complain about bugs, crashes, or performance inconsistencies, Adobe's hold on the creative industry only grew stronger. Premiere Pro became the editor of choice for vloggers, journalists, short film creators, and even major studios. Productions like Gone Girl and Deadpool famously used Premiere Pro for major Hollywood releases, proving that it could hang with and even replace Avid and Final Cut at the top of the professional ladder. So while Adobe's subscription model was very divisive at first, and it's still pretty divisive today, it ultimately cemented Premiere's place as the dominant video editor for the digital age. By the late 2010s, Adobe Premiere Pro had become the default video editor for millions of creators, but competition was heating up once again. In 2011, Apple completely rebooted its editing software with Final Cut Pro 10, much like when Adobe rebuilt Premiere into Premiere Pro back in 2003. Apple's rewrite was bold and very controversial. Final Cut Pro 10 introduced the magnetic timeline and background rendering, a simplified interface aimed at accessibility, but it also dropped many features professionals relied on, like XML support and multicam editing. It also dropped traditional track-based timelines. The backlash was immediate. It was very intense. Many editors jumped ship, but where were they going to go? They went to Premiere Pro. This migration helped push Premiere into even more studios and production houses. Adobe capitalized on Apple's stumble by marketing Premiere as professional, familiar, and cross-platform. It could run on Mac or Windows, integrate directly with After Effects and Photoshop, and it didn't require a completely new editing mindset, like the magnetic timeline had for some people. But a few years later, another contender appeared, DaVinci Resolve. What started as a high-end color grading tool slowly transformed into a full video editing software. By the late 2010s, Resolve offered editing, color, audio, and even visual effects all in one package. Blackmagic Design's aggressive updates and the free version made it a very serious contender, especially for the indie filmmakers who didn't want to pay a subscription fee. Suddenly, Adobe was no longer the scrappy alternative to Avid or Final Cut, it was the establishment. The Creative Cloud model, while still powerful, became a point of frustration for many users who preferred a one-time purchase. And while Premiere remained feature-rich and widely supported, issues like stability and performance occasionally gave Resolve or Final Cut an edge in certain workflows. Even as DaVinci Resolve gained ground and Final Cut refined its user base, Premiere Pro remained the center of modern video production. From YouTube documentaries and Twitch highlights to feature films and streaming series, Adobe had come full circle, from Randy Ubilous' early experiments on the Mac in the early 1990s to a subscription-powered creative empire in the 2020s. So that's the story of Premiere Pro so far. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy it, then I want you to consider subscribing if you're new here, and liking as well, since it lets YouTube know I'm doing a good job. It also lets me know I'm doing a good job. And, if you are returning to the channel and you're already subscribed, then consider becoming a member, since it helps out just a little bit. It gets you access to these videos anywhere from like 3 days early to 10 minutes early, depending on when I finish it and just actually decide to push it out. You also get access to the members-only show, where I talk about whatever's interesting. I talk about whatever's interesting me at the moment, and I let you know the videos are coming along. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.